Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Hello everyone, it's the 21st of June and we are watching episode 176 of Give the People What They Want. Happy to be back after a brief hiatus, and we've got an amazing set of stories. As you know, the show brought to you by People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. We also have with us Roger McKenzie of the Morning Star, who has been giving us some really good stories since past week. A lot of stories, like I said, to talk about today. This has been an especially active week in the halls of international diplomacy. We'll come to some of those stories in due course. But we want to start by talking about Kenya, a very important country in Africa, a huge, a key driver of its economy as well. Well, massive protests have broken out against a tax proposal. Now, Kenya's President William Ruto, notorious for following the diktats of the IMF, for following the instructions of international finance bodies, and many of his proposals have run into a huge amount of opposition over time. And this one, the people have taken to the streets again. A lot happening on the streets of Kenya. Roger, take us to what is happening there.
Thanks. So thousands of people demonstrating this week against these tax hikes that are basically just playing to what IMF and the World Bank kind of wants Kenya to be doing. Brutal clampdown by the Kenyan authorities. They always make a point of saying that protest is completely legal in Kenya, and then they also make a point of clamp on protests. At least 39 injured, and one person that we know of so far who's been killed tragically. So the sort of things they've been protesting about, hike in medical national insurance plan. There was even a proposal to put a tax on bread, basically, so VAT on bread, but also importantly as well, a tax on sanitary towels. And I mean, this pure craziness, really, and playing to the IMF. Now, Ruto was forced to climb down because of the protests on some of this. The Communist Party of Kenya has completely condemned the proposals and were at the forefront of these demonstrations, and have denounced the proposals for what they are as neoliberal, kind of bash on the people by Ruto and his party. It's really good news that he's been forced to back down, which will give confidence to the protesters that they can actually make some changes. But I think everybody knows that they're in for the long haul on this, is that Ruto will feel that he's been painted into a corner. So the protests must continue. I think what's really interesting about this as well is how most of the kind of corporate media aren't covering this at all. And I think one of the reasons for that is Ruto is the kind of new darling of the West. It was only a few weeks ago that he was in the White House, hobnobbing with Biden, being courted by Biden. But also what we've seen is that it is a non-NATO ally, and essentially what that means is that it places Kenya on a whole new kind of level in their relationship with the US and the Western powers. So the people of Kenya are rising up against these, and I think like a large part of Africa who are faced with the interference by colonial powers and the Western financial institutions. People have had enough. So I think we can look forward to more demonstrations, more protests against these real draconian cuts that are being proposed, and we'll see where that takes us. But tragic news is that at least one person has lost their life and more have been injured. But I think people in Kenya with the Communist Party of Kenya at the forefront of this, have stood up, and they've seen that they can have some success in over some of these plans, and hopefully they can have more success.
Right, you can actually see a very important article by Nicholas Mwangi in the People's Dispatch site. And like Roger was pointing out, it's almost been a year since very similar protests took place in July 2023, in fact, over another proposal on fuel taxes, massive protests, many people killed, and William Ruto clearly not learning any lessons, continuing with those policies which have proved so destructive in many parts of the world. And of course, there has been pushback from some quarters, but clearly not enough. And Kenya is an example of that, where the governments have refused to push back. One place where governments are trying to push back is Latin America. And we have seen all kinds of experiences taking place in Latin America. It's very difficult to push back against the IMF, against the kind of, not just the specific policies of the IMF, but the culture that these international financial institutions have brought, the thinking they have brought to how economic policies are defined in various countries. Even the idea of reforms itself, the word reform itself has become so loaded because of what the IMF and the World Bank have done. So in this context, quite interesting to see another interpretation of what reforms are. And this is happening in Colombia with President Gustavo Petro. Zoe, take us through what Petro's idea of reforms are, and what has been happening over there.
Well, it's very interesting because when Petro was elected, he made 3 promises to the Colombian people that he was going to majorly overhaul the healthcare system, the regimen of labor rights, and the pensions. And he is actually, this has been one of the key tasks of him in the executive, and also his sizable parliamentarian group of Colombia Humana and all the allies of what was his coalition to get elected. And so this past week, they scored 2 very important victories in actually taking this pledge forward, which was passing the pension reform, and then, just a day after that, making an important victory for the labor reform in the country. This, of course, has gotten a lot of pushback from the right wing. There's been major media attacks. I mean, this was something that they attempted to do last year, and they were both defeated in Congress. But this year they managed to engage in quite heated negotiations to get at least some version of both of these reforms passed. The pension reform is hugely important. It attempts to kind of fight back against the neoliberal privatized system that had been installed in the country, and actually strengthen the state's pension system and expand access and coverage to people who are already actually in their old age, and expand access, redefine the rules of who's able to really benefit from this system. This is huge because we see just a couple 1,000 kilometers or 100 kilometers south. This is exactly what Javier Milei is trying to reverse in Argentina. It's quite funny, as Colombia is taking steps away from its neoliberal past. Argentina, which had actually some of the strongest public institutions, is trying to reverse this. The labor reform that was passed makes very, very important reforms, for example, in what constitutes a full week of work, what constitutes overtime, how to get payment for holidays, Social Security. These sound like details, but they're actually hugely important. The collective rights, the rights to unionization that are granted in this are not small things. That being said, because of the defeats that they suffered last year, there was a very important need by the Colombia Humana parties and this party itself to actually get it passed, which meant that they had to make several concessions. And so with the labor reform was perhaps the most impacted by this. And the trade union confederations in Colombia issued a declaration after it was passed in the 7th Commission, condemning that the right-wing parties forced certain concessions onto this labor reform, and that there were very crucial elements that had to do with union rights that were not actually included in the current version of this reform. The labor reform was only passed in the commission. It still has to, there's several hurdles that it has to go through before it can actually be implemented as law, but it got through the first hurdle, which means it will be able to be debated in the next session of Congress when it resumes in July. It was important for them to get it done before this cutoff, before they go to recess. And we're going to see how that continues. Similarly, the pension reform still has steps before it will be implemented. But again, these were the promises that Gustavo Petro had made with his government of change. Progress for sure, but there's still a lot to be done.
Right. So it's very important you mentioned those details, because I think it kind of illustrates that, the difficulty, like I was earlier saying as well, of making progress in a world where so much of the institutional structure is loaded against you. You have decades of policy prescriptions, decades of thinking, like I said, which really acts as a barrier to any kind of reform. And Colombia is no exception to countries which have sort of tried to reverse this trend, to reverse this tendency. And of course, equally important to note the fact that Gustavo Petro, of course, has substantially reversed Colombia's foreign policy approach as well. His predecessors, some of the most closest allies of the United States, often voting with the US against, on opinions which most of the world was against. Petro has been, a mark very different in that way, including on the question of West Asia itself. The positions he's taken, very interesting. And moving on to West Asia, many things to talk about. Of course, the most important thing right now being Lebanon, where a crisis definitely does seem to be brewing. And this, of course, calling it a crisis is a bit maybe disingenuous, because it's a crisis that is caused by one country or two countries there. That's in this case Israel and the United States. And of course, the United States, while causing this crisis, has also been sending diplomats, in this case Amos Hochstein, who's been their key points person for Lebanon, to try to negotiate supposedly with Lebanese parties. And the terms of his negotiation seem quite strange, or even weird for that matter. What Amos Hochstein is telling the Lebanese interlocutors is that, Israel is all about to attack, so you need to control Hezbollah. That seems to be really the message that he is delivering on behalf of President Joe Biden to his Lebanese interlocutors, including the Lebanese Prime Minister. And this is shortly after Israel murdered a very senior Hezbollah commander. And even as, for instance, the Israeli army has said that it has plans ready for an invasion of Lebanon, for that matter. And then Israel's foreign minister also indicating that that is a possibility. Now, Hezbollah has been very clear that any misadventure of this sort will have very, very dangerous consequences for Israel. They have shown their capacity in the past. Now, we know that Israel has failed to destroy Hamas in any way at all, despite all these claims about being, of their having such superior military capability, of them being qualitatively different, etc. They have, their operation has completely failed. And Hezbollah is, at an even a much more sophisticated level in terms of its capacity itself. In fact, they released some drone footage of the port of Haifa, I believe, which was a clear indication that don't underestimate us. But also the fact that the reason for these battles, the reason for this whole crisis is essential. It's not just enough to look at the military standpoint here. Hezbollah's operations in this sector began after Israel's invasion of Palestine, of Gaza. And Hezbollah has made it clear, like many of its allies in what is called the Axis of Resistance, that it will continue these operations as long as Israel's genocidal assault continues. Hezbollah has made it clear that it is it will stop its operations immediately when there is a truce. And this truce does not happen because while the entire world is calling for a truce, Israel just simply refuses to accept it. So that is the basis of Hezbollah's own operation. Whereas for Israel, which at this point has become, it's difficult to even call it a government. It has become, a completely almost unhinged its government has become something like that. For Israel, this is just a way of trying to, their aim is to try to destroy Hezbollah itself, which failed in 2006 miserably, that attempt. And now there's a thought that we can have a second front, so to speak, and try to destroy Hezbollah and then create some kind of a buffer zone or whatever. So this line of thinking, of course, extremely, extremely dangerous, because We've already seen the impact of the war in Gaza. Zoe is going to talk about it next. But what this might bring to Lebanon is a very, very dangerous thought. And the solution to this is actually quite simple, and is what the entire world has been demanding, that there should be a truce in Gaza. And that has been the demand of the Hezbollah, that has been the demand of Ansarullah, that has been the demand of the militias in Iraq. All of them have made that very simple demand, that this is all really what we're looking for. And Israel has completely refused to heed that. But what we're seeing is that instead, with this kind of rhetoric, with the kind of, this thing that, we are all ready for an invasion of Lebanon, etc., etc., significantly raising the temperatures. It has done a number of attacks on Lebanon over the past many months. Leaders of Hezbollah being assassinated in these assaults, and it is clear that it intends to continue to do it. Intends to do so even in the future. All this really raising temperatures, taking the whole country, that region, further to the brink of war. And yet another example of, I think, what we've been saying on this show, that the entity that has actually taken West Asia to the brink, that is causing so much disaster, is Israel single-handedly, with the support of the United States, as is clear from the kind of brief Amos Hochstein seems to have got when he's going there to supposedly prevent war. So, a lot of Lebanon, clearly an area to sort of a country to watch out in the coming weeks, and we'll be covering it in future episodes of the show as well. Like I said in the beginning, this is episode 176 of Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch and Globetrotter, and that's Zoe, Roger McKenzie, and I trying to bring you stories from across the world this very busy week. And from Lebanon, we'll move to the situation in Palestine itself, where the death toll continues to increase. Israeli military operations not ceasing at all. Zoe, give us a quick update on what's happening there.
Well, the devastation, of course, continues across Gaza. Continually horrific images and numbers coming out. For example, the UNRWA reported that over 50,000 children in Gaza are experiencing severe malnutrition due to the restrictions on humanitarian aid. We know that there was some sort of agreement that attacks would stop during the daytime so that there would be more provision for aid to enter. Different humanitarian groups have said that this is still not happening, and that they're not even close to reaching the threshold of what is needed and what is normal for the number of trucks coming into Gaza to provide this aid. Hospitals still in critical crisis. They, of course, not only need medical supplies, but they need fuel to make sure that these facilities can function. We know that in many cases, these hospitals are at complete capacity, dealing with all sorts of injuries, and not only of course, the already chronic illnesses that people having to deal with are completely being undertreated. I highly recommend everyone to check out the continuous coverage of the attacks on Gaza's healthcare system that we've been doing with our partners at the People's Health Movement. Over 100 Gazan health professionals are still being held in illegal Israeli detention. We know that this has actually included massive amounts of torture. Everyone who has been released from Israeli detention in the past several months has reported the most atrocious acts of torture. And many of these healthcare workers have actually been killed in their detention. Some are disappeared. So it's a very critical situation. All that to say, this week we saw further cracks within the Israeli establishment. We know that Benny Gantz left the government. We know that Netanyahu dissolved the war cabinet, which had been created following October 7th. And interesting admissions from the spokesperson of the Israeli occupation forces that said it was impossible to defeat Hamas. And he said a famous sort of formulation that many have said in the years of history, which is that Hamas is an idea. And I mean, essentially this, you can't kill an idea, essentially is what he's saying. And that really Hamas has gotten stronger over the past several months. This is interesting because little by little, these cracks continue to emerge. There was a week of action in Israel, tens of thousands of people mobilizing, of course, some of them just for the release of the hostages, but they want an agreement. They want a ceasefire. They're unhappy with how Netanyahu is handling it. his political allies more and more, seeing the futility of this campaign and seeing how much they're falling in the world standing in terms of their position. These cracks are going to continue to emerge. I think these are the most severe declarations that we've heard. This is literally the spokesperson from IDF questioning Israel's ability to defeat Hamas. So again, these cracks are going to continue to emerge. This is what is going to put the pressure on Israel to hopefully end its genocidal campaign and its disgusting and atrocious war on the Palestinian people.
Right, Joe, you mentioned the attacks on Gaza's health system. And I think one thing People's Dispatch has focused on over the years is also how this is not something that started just in October. Across both in Gaza and the West Bank, there has been over decades a very concerted attempt to sort of degrade the health system of Gaza. Israel has been conducting these operations or creating the conditions for that with the full support of the United States, the European powers, all of these countries which claim to stand for human rights, which claim to stand for providing humanitarian aid, etc., etc. And and Gaza has become what it is today, and the West Bank is what it is today because of those years and decades of siege, which the global powers have by de facto imposed on these regions. And just going to another part of the world which has consistently been under siege, and that's Haiti. And we know that over the years we've seen reports of how Haiti is in some ways portrayed as some kind of a failed state consistently. That's the narrative that the international media consistently portrays. It's like Haiti is in a bubble, and the people are just people are like that, so it's a failed state. Whereas the conditions for that, why that has happened is really not examined. So Roger has a story from Haiti which really goes into, I think, the key question there, and it's about gang violence, which is often talked about when Haiti is mentioned. So take us through it, Roger.
Yeah, I mean, talking about cracks emerging. So apologies for the cracks that seem to be emerging in my Wi-Fi. I'm in a conference centre in Brighton, of all places, in the south of England. But I do think it's really important that we all keep Haiti on the radar. And I think in the sea of things that are happening across the world, it's really easy sometimes to take our eye off this particular ball. But there's a report that's just come out that talks about nearly 600,000 people who have been displaced since March by violence in Haiti. And this is a real blight that people are having to put up with and have had to put up with for some considerable time. The violence is often portrayed as coming from gangs. I think that's a really simplistic way of looking at it and portraying these as gangs, when certainly I'm sure there is some criminal elements involved there, but there are also people who are trying to maintain some sovereignty for Haiti as well. So I do think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But one of the reasons that I think it's important for us all to keep our eye on this particular ball is because I think far too often we fail to get underneath, well, what is actually going on here? And one of those questions, I think, is about why it is that in one of the poorest countries in the world, they are able to get so many weapons. Somebody is providing those weapons. There is no money in Haiti to be able to buy lots of weapons. So somebody's doing that. Somebody's funding it. And I was kind of reminded of I think it was a Security Council resolution a couple of years ago that talked about the way that the US is involved. So they keep popping up in these discussions. They certainly see Haiti as being part of their sphere of influence in their backyard and so on. But there's plenty of evidence to suggest, and certainly people that I'm talking to on the ground are saying that they believe the US is funding this violence so that they can exert their influence on Haiti. And I think we need to look at that in the context of everything else that we've actually spoken about this afternoon, and the role that the US plays in trying to foment violence and divisions and so on. And linking to the earlier story that I was talking about in terms of Kenya, of course, one of the things that the US is trying to do is to provide a black face to their intervention in Haiti by having the Kenyans come over and lead a so-called multinational military force within Haiti, and there's discussions been taking place this week about how that should be pursued. But the message that we hear, we certainly hear, but I don't think is ever reported again on the corporate media, is how the people in Haiti are against this because they've had experience of these interventions before. So we've actually got the US seemingly funding dissension within the country, funding violence within the country, and then sending in the police force to police the violence that they're involved in. I mean, this is really cynical stuff, really disgraceful behaviour by the United States, and we need to keep calling this out. But I suppose I just wanted to make the point about how important it is that we don't lose sight of what's happening in Haiti and the way that the US is still intervening and wants to ramp up that interference by getting this police force from Kenya over there. And we've seen the sort of clampdown that they impose on their own people. So what are they going to do if they come over to Haiti?
Absolutely, Roger. And talking of conflict, ramping up conflicts, there's a global conflict going on which the United States seems to be keen on ramping up on a very periodic basis. And like I said at the beginning of the show, busy week in the halls of international diplomacy. We saw a summit in Switzerland to discuss the state of, or discuss peace in the context of the Ukraine war. Quite a weird summit, actually. Come to some of the details, but important to note that the summit happening after the G7 summit that took place. G7 summit, also a very strange summit. Most of the leaders having suffered pretty bad electoral defeats or on the verge of suffering pretty bad electoral defeats. Can't think of a G7 summit which had, where the participating leaders had such low credibility in the recent past. But there too, the G7 countries expressing strong support for Ukraine. And as a follow-up to that, there was this peace summit in Switzerland that happened. Now 90 countries participated. That's quite a big number. But the important thing to note is that there was clearly a division on what the definition of a peace summit should be. Because you had a peace summit for a war between Russia and Ukraine in which Russia was clearly not invited. And so this was pointed out by a number of countries from the global south. For instance, you have your BRICS countries, which for India, South Africa, Brazil, and Brazil did not sign this agreement. Saudi Arabia didn't sign it. The UAE didn't sign it. Mexico didn't sign it. So the resolution that came out of this peace summit was somehow not approved by some of the biggest countries, some of the most powerful countries in the world, which clearly have a stake and have an opinion on how this issue should be resolved. China was invited, didn't participate, again citing the same reason that Russia had not been invited. And finally, what came out of this peace summit was a resolution which more or less entirely mirrored Vladimir Zelensky's points of what he thinks is peace on Ukraine's terms, which is really not, I think, how peace works at this point, especially so many years into this conflict. And what we see here is basically a kind of summit being held as a facade to sort of say that, oh, hey, we are trying for peace, while injecting a huge amount of money into the war. The United States, for instance, now saying that, now considering the possibility of US weapons being used inside Russian territory. The G7 summit saw, I believe, $50 billion being promised, which would come from assets seized from Russia. So there is a constant ramping up from the side of the West as well in terms of this conflict. And The peace summit really just is presenting a series of proposals, presenting a series of ideas which the Western countries know will not be accepted. Now, Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, also presenting his proposals which pretty much align to what was presented in 2022, some months after the war started, when it seemed that Russia and Ukraine were close to achieving peace. And apparently that was sabotaged by Boris Johnson and his US allies. That's what the reports say. So Putin's still sticking to that. The Western countries, promising Zelensky aid and offering proposals which clearly there's going to be no negotiation on. So it does seem like definitely, there's going to be this conflict. This definitely likely to continue. Ukrainian forces at a disadvantage at this point. Meanwhile, Putin has signed and went to North Korea. Very interesting meeting. A lot of hype about it. I don't think they have met in the recent past, but the amount of hype around this meeting was quite unusual. They've signed an agreement for collaboration, promising to assist each other, if there is any assault. But like Indian expert M.K. Bhadrakumar has pointed out, it's more likely that the economic aspects of this agreement are going to be far more significant for both Russia and North Korea, so them strengthening their alliance. So that's a very interesting move at this point of time as well. All this together, like I said, it's a very newsy week as far as multiple regions, multiple countries have been concerned. And it's been a pleasure to bring all of this to our viewers. We'll be doing this every week. We have been doing this for 175 weeks and more. This is week number 176. We missed a few weeks in between, so it's actually more. And so do tune in next Friday as well for more stories and give the people what they want. And for today, farewell from Zoe, Roger, and I.